I want to take a couple of minutes and tell you a couple of stories. One of the stories you're probably quite familiar with. The other story you probably have not heard at all, or perhaps some of you have heard parts of it. We find our first story in the Old Testament reading from Genesis. It's the story of Joseph and his brothers. Now, I have read this story many times, but for some reason in preparing for today, this story just totally resonated with me. Joseph was favored by his father, Jacob, and Jacob loved all of his sons, but he tended to favor Joseph, and he gave him this multicolored robe that several of us have heard about. Now, Dolly Parton's mother was extremely familiar with this Bible story, and it inspired Dolly to write this wonderful song called The Robe of Many Colors, which she has sung many times. Now, Dolly Parton's family was dirt poor, but she proudly wore this coat that her mother made from her from rags. In doing so, she had to endure humiliation of her classmates as they laughed at her. She, however, said that her classmates really never understood her because she felt rich, because the coat that her mother made her had love sewed into every stitch. Joseph's brothers never really understood his relationship with his father, and they chastised him. They wanted to get rid of him as they didn't feel loved as much by their father. Joseph was hated by his envious and jealous brothers. And the last time that he had seen them, they had just beaten him, thrown him in a pit, and then they sold him into slavery by some passing Ishmaelites who who carried him off into Egypt. And at this point in the story, Joseph has now become the most important person in Egypt, except, of course, for the Pharaoh himself. Now, he could crush his brothers, he could torture them, he could teach them a lesson. But what does he do? Instead, he says, not to worry. It wasn't them who did all that to him, really, but it was God who sent him to Egypt. The story resonates with me because of the way his brothers treated him, and they went about getting rid of him and selling him into slavery. But more importantly, it's Joseph's response to them. It resonates with me because his story is a story of grace, mercy, and forgiveness. And it is a wonderful example of how we should strive to live our lives. The second story that I want to share with you is kind of, I guess I would call it like a parallel story, and it's been developing now over the last couple of years. It's a story that you might not be familiar with. It's the story of the three sisters, two who were earnestly trying to do their best at settling their mother's estate. A story of one sister who was the executor of the estate, and the other, the littlest sister, who became very problematic, causing much pain and suffering due to not only what came out of her mouth that defiled her, but also due to her actions. Now, the littlest sister was like Joseph's brothers. She was angry and she was jealous of the relationship between her other two sisters. So she tried with all of her might to be a major obstacle during the settlement process, attempting to delay and obstruct. And in essence, she threw her two sisters into the pit to get what she wanted and desired. Now, I'm sure this is not a unique story, and many of you probably have similar stories or have heard a story like this from someone else. But this story is my story. As I look back on what I perceive as a wasted 2 years of my life, I discovered many positive things that came out of this time of pain and sorrow. Joseph's story and my story greatly, in that Joseph's story is a story about grace, mercy, forgiveness, and love. My story, not so much. I wish I could say that my story was the same or is the same, but it isn't. However, the good news is my story is not finished. So many people hide their true identities. I know this is true in my story. In Joseph's story, his coming out story, if you will, I can't help but wonder, what was the transformation in Joseph that enabled him to forgive and to reconcile with his brothers? If Joseph's brothers had not turned up, I wonder if Joseph would have ever gone home to see his family. I wonder if his story and my story would have been more similar had that happened. I do believe that Joseph's story teaches us that God is with us even, and maybe even especially when we go through the pits of life. When Joseph's brothers threw him in the pit, God was with him and protected him. When he was sold as a slave, God went with him. When Joseph was falsely accused of attacking the wife of the captain of Pharaoh's guard, he spent over 2 years in prison, but God was with him during that time there, and ultimately he was put in charge of the prison. Through all of these hardships, Joseph became a person of character. He was not the spoiled son, but became a respected man and leader. We recall the words of the Apostle Paul, who said, "Suffering produces perseverance and hope, and hope does not disappoint us, because God has poured out his love into our hearts." So even when we feel that God has abandoned us, and when we are in the pits of life, God is always with us, and he will strengthen us. Perhaps the most important thing that we learn from the Joseph story is about forgiveness. Joseph had the right, he had the power to punish his 10 half-brothers for doing what they did to him. He could have gotten revenge on them, but in his mercy, Joseph forgave his brothers and wept over them when they finally reconciled. We all must work for a day when everyone can say to those who hurt us, "I am Joseph, your brother." For me, I'm still working on that. But for now, I'm okay that my story is not complete, especially in light of the fact that some biblical commentators compare Joseph to God. That is, God has the right and the power to punish us, but rather than punish us, God has forgiven, restored relationship with us, just as Joseph did with his brothers. Joseph responded to them with love and forgiveness. That same love and forgiveness described in today's lesson from Romans, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. We also recall the words of Jesus from the cross. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." Joseph forgave his brothers, for they too did not really know what they were doing. So now you know the story of Joseph, and you know the story of the 3 sisters. Similar, yet different. Joseph's story of forgiveness, grace, mercy, and love, complete. My story, not so complete. And I've accepted that my story, the story of the 3 sisters, is a very slow work in progress. You know, in our culture, we tend to lean toward taking the quick, the easy, and the painless path. We hear such things as, "It's easy, just hop on this website, like us on Instagram or Facebook." But the biblical view of life is that God doesn't always look for the path of least resistance. Sometimes God asks us to walk through fiery furnaces or bear a cross. But on the other side of the valley of the shadow of death, we are always presented with the reality that God never left us. Joseph's story is finished, but the story of the three sisters is still waiting to bloom into the most beautiful and holiest of ways. But for now, we await the day when we hear the words of the psalmist in Psalm 133, "How good and pleasant it is when brethren live together in unity." In Christ's name, amen.